Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. The night had all the ingredients for disaster. An undercurrent of resentment mixed with frustration simmering just below the surface. Then, without warning, things took a turn, plunging into something much darker, or perhaps brighter, depending on how much fury I was willing to admit I was harboring. And there was no shortage of that. By the time the clock struck 11 p.m., I was sitting alone in the dim confines of my living room. Only a single floor lamp cast its glow, barely enough to illuminate my immediate surroundings. I'd been consumed by my work for hours, completely unaware of the deep darkness creeping beyond the edges of the light. The oppressive gloom felt like a reflection of my inner turmoil. With my legs crossed, I balanced a yellow legal pad on my lap, its surface filled with chaotic scrawls and carefully organized lists. I was wholly immersed in my thoughts when the sharp, unexpected sound of the doorbell shattered my concentration. My head jerked up as the silence of the house suddenly became apparent. Who would show up at such a late hour? It couldn't be my wife. She'd long abandoned any pretense of returning early from her girls' nights out. I set the legal pad and pen down on the floor, a wave of fatigue washing over me. Not the kind that comes from exertion, but the bone-deep exhaustion that settles in after living a life that feels like it's slowly eroding you. Pulling myself to my feet, I trudged to the door and flipped on the porch and hallway lights. Peering through the peephole, I saw two police officers standing stiffly on the front step. That's never a good sign. Bracing myself, I opened the door and attempted a disarming smile. "What trouble am I in now?" I quipped, hoping to inject some levity. Neither officer so much as smirked. This wasn't a casual visit. "Are you Zachary Novak?" the officer closest to the door asked. "Yes," I replied evenly. "And is your wife, Bonnie Novak?" "That's correct," I said, my curiosity now piqued. "What's this about?" Police officers are rarely straightforward. "May we come inside?" the lead officer asked, already inching forward as if expecting my permission. I stepped into his path, holding my ground. "No." The officer blinked, clearly unaccustomed to being denied. "Excuse me?" I said no. "You'll answer my question or leave," I said, the edge in my voice unmistakable. He stepped back, momentarily thrown off. "Have you been home all evening?" I folded my arms and stared him down like an intruder who had overstayed his welcome. "Yes. And that's the last answer you're getting until you tell me why you're here." My tone sharpened, and after a brief pause, the officers exchanged a glance before conceding. "Your wife has been injured and taken to Memorial Hospital," the lead officer finally said. In an instant, my thoughts shifted. Moments ago, I was meticulously plotting my wife's downfall, but now worry overwhelmed me. "What happened?" I asked, genuinely concerned. The officers remained vague. "May we come in?" the senior officer repeated. With a heavy sigh, I stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. They moved cautiously into the living room, their steps deliberate, as though walking into hostile territory. I flicked on the overhead light and slumped back into my chair. "Now, will you tell me what's going on?" I pressed, frustration creeping into my voice. The officers exchanged another glance before the senior one spoke. "Sir, we regret to inform you that your wife was shot earlier this evening." His words felt rehearsed, carefully measured, but they struck me like a blow. My mouth went dry. "Is she alive?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's in surgery," he replied. "Her condition is critical, but there's hope." Anger flared within me. "You didn't answer my question. Is she alive or not?" I demanded, my voice rising. Their hesitation was palpable, but eventually, the senior officer elaborated. "She's still alive, but her prognosis is uncertain. The weight of those words hit me like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe, gasping like a drowning man. The officers knelt beside me, urging me to focus on breathing. Embarrassed by my reaction, I nodded mutely and tried to regain my composure. "She was shot?" I asked once I steadied myself. The question hung heavy in the air. My mind raced with a troubling thought I dared not say aloud. Who besides me would want to do that? "Is there anything else you can tell me?" I asked, my voice steadier now. The officers straightened, resuming their formal demeanor. "Your wife was at a motel with another man," the senior officer began, his tone businesslike. "From what we've gathered, his wife must have arrived unexpectedly. She likely knocked on the door, and he opened it without thinking. She then fired multiple rounds, hitting them both. The man was killed instantly. Your wife was luckier. She survived, though not unscathed." The full scope of the situation left me reeling. "So you're here to see if I had anything to do with this?" I asked, piecing the puzzle together. Their expressions remained unreadable. "We know who pulled the trigger," the officer admitted. "But we need to confirm there was no additional involvement, and we have to ensure your wife's safety when she returns home." I couldn't suppress a bitter smile. "She's been safe for weeks." "Why would that change now?" I said, my sarcasm flying over their heads. On a whim, I reached for a manila envelope beside my chair. The younger officer tensed, his hand hovering near his holster. "Relax," I said flatly. "It's just paperwork." I handed the envelope to the senior officer. "I visited my lawyer earlier today. She suggested I start making lists," I explained, gesturing toward the legal pad on the floor, littered with notes for the impending divorce. Inside the envelope were photos of my wife, with a man I didn't recognize. The officer flipped through them, his face impassive. "Do you know the man's name?" I asked. The officer didn't look up. "I think you already do," he said. His younger partner, breaking his silence for the first time, muttered, "They look different without the bullet holes." His superior shot him a sharp reprimand before turning back to me. "Apologies for his comment. He's still learning." I waved it off, unbothered. There were more pressing matters at hand. My wife's life hung by a thread, and for now, the divorce would have to wait. Life had once again taken a turn I hadn't anticipated. Once again, I repeated that I'd been home all evening, pointing out the timely phone call from my brother that supported my alibi. They didn't let me off the hook easily, firmly reminding me not to harm my wife when she returned. I didn't see the value in adding more detail, so I stuck to my story. It seemed to satisfy them. When they were ready to leave, I walked them to the door, turned off the lights, and returned to my chair. Sitting back down, I tried to process the shocking news they'd just delivered. She'd been shot. Of all the scenarios I'd envisioned, that one hadn't even crossed my mind. As much as I despised her for what she'd done, I never wanted her dead. I'd hoped she'd live with the weight of her actions, crying herself to sleep in an empty bed, abandoned by others just as she'd betrayed me. Though deep down, I knew she'd never feel that kind of remorse. The night had begun with me immersing myself in tasks my lawyer had given me, desperate to quiet the endless storm of questions her betrayal had stirred in my mind. Now I knew who was involved, but the motive remained a mystery. Sure, our marriage had seen its fair share of rough times. What marriage doesn't? But she had a talent for unearthing faults where none existed, even digging for reasons to be unhappy. It wasn't until our divorce created some distance that I fully understood how deep it ran. Whatever had driven her to sabotage her life had now ensnared me in a murder investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to click into place. I wasn't the only victim in her web of deceit. Grabbing my phone, I dialed my lawyer's private line. She picked up after 4 rings, her tone sharp and impatient. "This better be urgent or you'll be funding my next vacation," Karen snapped. Karen Thompson wasn't the warm and fuzzy type, but her no-nonsense demeanor gave me a strange sense of security. As a divorce lawyer, she was sharp and relentless, though she could crack a joke when least expected. "And who says I'm joking?" she added when I didn't respond. "I need you to find a criminal lawyer, preferably one who's still awake." I heard a loud thud on her end. "Please tell me you didn't do anything reckless," she demanded. "I didn't," I said quickly. "But someone else did. The police just left my house." Her tone sharpened even more. "Why were they there?" "Her lover's wife shot them. He's dead, and she's in surgery. The wife is going to need a lawyer. I doubt she has one." Karen let out a long sigh. "First, tell me, did you have anything to do with this? And say it like you mean it." "I had nothing to do with it," I replied firmly. "Say it like I should believe you," she pressed. "I'm telling the truth," I insisted. "The police came by to inform me. I think they suspect me, but I wasn't involved." "All right," she said after a pause. "Then why is this your concern?" "It shouldn't be. But if we hadn't had that conversation in your office, I might have been the one in that hospital bed. I just want to make sure she's not completely alone in this." Karen sighed again. "Do you know where they've taken her?" "Probably to the police station. This town isn't big enough for much else." "Stay where you are. I'll find someone to handle this and make sure she's got representation. And, Zachary?" "Yes?" "Don't do anything stupid. Keep your distance, at least 10 feet, and make sure you've got witnesses if you're ever near her." "Understood." "And Zachary? You're not responsible for this. None of it. It's going to be okay. Do you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, hanging up the phone with a faint smirk. Only Karen had the ability to make me feel like a reprimanded teenager. After a quick shower and change of clothes, I drove to the hospital. There was no need to rush. The love I once felt for Bonnie had died long before tonight. This wasn't about her. It was about doing what was necessary, like ensuring her insurance covered the medical bills and the staff didn't cut corners. When I arrived, Bonnie was out of surgery, stable, and heavily sedated in recovery. The surgeon assured me she'd pull through. I left the hospital staff with her insurance details and headed home, asking them to call if anything changed. It was well past midnight by the time I got back. Too restless to sleep, I started mentally ticking off tasks. One thing couldn't wait: calling her parents. I picked up the phone and dialed. Her father, Joe, answered groggily. "Do you know what time it is?" "I know, Joe. I'm sorry to wake you, but I needed to call. Bonnie's been hurt." "Hurt? What do you mean?" His voice immediately sharpened. "She was shot. Her lover's wife shot them both. He's dead, and she's in recovery. She's going to survive." There was silence as Joe processed my words. "Shot? What are you talking about? Are you drunk?" "No, Joe. I'm completely sober. The police came by earlier, and I've been to the hospital. She's sedated. There's no need to rush over tonight, but I thought you should know." "Why aren't you with her?" he asked, his tone accusatory. I exhaled, too drained to argue. "Joe, she was shot by her lover's wife. Did you hear what I said? Her lover's wife." "You're insane. Bonnie doesn't have a lover," he said flatly. "She does. Or did. He's dead now, but she's alive," I replied matter-of-factly. Another pause. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer. "Are you sure? Could you be mistaken?" "Am I wrong about her cheating or her getting shot?" I asked, because the answer's no to both. Joe fell silent again. Then, cautiously, he asked, "What are you going to do now?" "I'm sorry, Joe," I said firmly, "but I've already hired a lawyer. I'm divorcing her. Zachary, can't you reconsider?" Joe's voice carried a mix of urgency and concern. "She's been shot. She's going to need your support." "I needed her too, Joe," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "But while I needed her, she was off sleeping with someone else." "So that's it?" Joe pressed, searching for some sign of hesitation. "That's it," I confirmed firmly. "I'll make sure she's financially secure through this ordeal, and the lawyers can handle the rest." But I can't keep doing this. The lies, Joe. The lies are worse than the cheating. She looked me in the eye and lied so convincingly that I didn't suspect a thing. Joe paused, taking a moment to let my words sink in. What gave her away? It was the distance, I explained. She started pulling away, making excuses, filling her time with plans that didn't include me. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so I hired a private investigator. He found everything I needed to know. After that, my mind was made up. Joe's shoulders sagged under the weight of disappointment. Her mom and I were hoping for grandkids, you know. We really thought they were in your future. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew how much they wanted that, and I'd wanted it too. Once. I'm sorry, Joe. I truly am, I said quietly. Just one favor, he asked, and I braced for it. Can you wait? Hold off on making anything final until Bonnie has recovered and the two of you have had a chance to talk. But that wasn't all. And don't disappear. Marie and I see you as the son we never had. No matter what happens with Bonnie, we don't want to lose you. I was blindsided. After all the deceit, the betrayal, and the chaos, this was the moment that finally broke me. For the first time, I felt tears threatening to fall. I love you and Marie too, Joe. I really do. I'm not going anywhere, I promised him. When the call ended, I felt utterly drained. Fully clothed, I collapsed onto my bed and slipped into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my window, dragging me reluctantly into consciousness. Unready to face the day, I lowered the blinds, stripped off my clothes, and crawled back under the covers for 2 more hours of fitful but necessary rest. Eventually, I forced myself to shower, dress, and grab a quick meal before heading to the hospital. By the time I arrived at Bonnie's room around 11, her parents were already there. To my surprise, she was awake and alert. I'd expected her to still be under heavy sedation, but apparently I didn't know much about recovering from a gunshot wound. I braced myself for regret, perhaps even an apology. Instead, her eyes lit with fury the moment I entered the room. "You bastard!" she spat. "You killed him, didn't you? You killed Ben!" So much for the tired excuse that it didn't mean anything. Before I could respond, 2 nurses rushed into the room, brushing past me, and a pair of orderlies appeared at my side, clearly treating me like a potential threat. I held her gaze, completely unshaken. "No, Bonnie," I said coldly. "His wife killed him. I guess you and Ben weren't as careful as you thought, or maybe she's just smarter than I was." That silenced her. She slumped back into the bed, tears streaking her face, while the staff moved to console her. A moment later, they asked me to leave, and I didn't put up a fight. Walking down the hallway, I couldn't shake the thought. Had I ever really known this woman? One thing was certain. She had never truly known me. Near the elevator, 2 security guards intercepted me. "Sir, could we have a word?" "No," I replied curtly. "I've already spoken to the police and they've cleared me. If you want to involve them again, go ahead. But I won't let the baseless accusations of a cheating woman give you authority over me. If you touch me, I'll sue. Your choice." The guards exchanged uneasy looks as I stepped into the elevator and left the hospital. The police never contacted me again. Bonnie tried to file charges, but when the shooter confessed at the scene, there wasn't much of a case. As for the shooter, Melody Robinson, I hired a lawyer to ensure she was placed in a psychiatric facility instead of prison. I visit her occasionally. She's lucid, perhaps more so than most people I know. Once she even quipped, "Think you could smuggle in a hacksaw for me? Maybe in a box of chocolates?" That's when I realized she might be saner than the rest of us. My lawyer had done right by her. The divorce was a straightforward ordeal. Bonnie didn't want me. She wanted everything else. She demanded all we owned and a share of my future earnings. In the end, she got half of what we had, and no alimony. The judge, unimpressed by her entitlement, told her plainly, "You have a job, Mrs. Novak. You can work. I've often considered tattooing those words on my arm. Looking back, I'm grateful for three things: an excellent lawyer who guided me through the mess, two remarkable in-laws who still treat me like family, and a judge who wasn't afraid to be blunt. As for Bonnie, she rarely crosses my mind. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started.
I swear, I never meant for him to hear me. I'm not some heartless monster. My name is Grace. I'm 31. And sure, I have a bit of a flair for the dramatic. But this was never supposed to happen. I was in my kitchen, venting to Lillian, my go-to for either hyping me up or dragging me back down to reality, depending on the situation. And wow, was I in full rant mode. "You know what, Lillian?" I said, swirling my coffee like I was the lead in some over-the-top soap opera. "If I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't have married Buck." Yeah, I actually said that. Out loud, not even in a whisper. It left my mouth as casually as if I were complaining about a bad haircut. Now, before you clutch your pearls, let me explain. It's not that Buck is awful. He's not. He's fine. And that's exactly the problem. He's just fine. Predictable to the point of being infuriating. Is mindlessly scrolling through his phone while half watching ESPN even a hobby? Because, in Buck's world, apparently, it is. Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Oh, come on, Grace. You don't really mean that." "Don't I?" I shot back. He was just there. Like a roommate who covered half the bills, but never figured out how to properly load a dishwasher. If I had known this was what marriage felt like, I would have swiped left on the whole thing. I even let out a ridiculous, exaggerated villain laugh, because, honestly, it fit the moment. Lillian gave me a look, a mix of disbelief and concern. But before she could say anything, something in the air shifted. The room suddenly felt heavier, the silence stretching like a rubber band about to snap. I turned my head, and there he was. Buck, standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable. Not angry, not sad. Just blank. Empty in a way that made my stomach plummet. I would have preferred yelling, anything but that hollow expression. "Buck!" I started, but he just lifted a hand. No words, no accusations, just a quiet exit. He grabbed his keys and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there, frozen. Finally, I turned to Lillian. "What the hell was that?" She stared at me like I had suddenly grown a second head. "Are you serious? You literally just said you wouldn't have married him. What did you expect him to do? Applaud?" I rolled my eyes. "He's being dramatic. He'll be back in an hour." Spoiler. He didn't come back. An hour stretched into 2, then 3. By midnight, I was curled up on the couch, mindlessly scrolling TikTok, pretending I wasn't falling apart inside. But oh, I was fuming. Who does he think he is? Storming off over one little comment? Lillian, still lounging on my couch and scrolling Instagram like this was just another girls' night, finally spoke. "Maybe you should text him," I scoffed. "Why? So he can ignore me like some brooding teenager? No thanks. He'll come crawling back when he's done sulking." Except, I wasn't so sure. Where was he? What was he doing? Who was he with? Okay, that last part was a bit dramatic. This was Buck we were talking about. The same guy who thought mismatched socks were a bold fashion statement. But still. By 1 a.m., Lillian tapped out, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my growing frustration. Eventually, I caved and sent him a text. "You good?" No response. Fine, be that way. I wrapped myself in a blanket, convincing myself I wouldn't lose sleep over this. He'd come back when he was ready, and I'd be waiting with a smug told you so. Except, he didn't. By morning, his side of the bed was untouched. His toothbrush was still there. His shoes sat neatly by the door. He hadn't packed up and disappeared forever. But where the hell was he? I called. Straight to voicemail. Who even uses voicemail anymore? Now I wasn't just irritated. I was livid. How dare he make me worry like this? It's not like I said anything that bad. Everyone complains about their spouse. It's practically a marital rite of passage. But no, Buck had to make it a whole thing. I grabbed my phone and called Lillian. The second she picked up, I blurted, "He's still gone." "Did you apologize?" she asked, way too calmly. "Apologize?" My voice shot up an octave. For what? Being honest? For saying something he wasn't even supposed to hear? Lillian sighed. "Grace, come on. You basically said you regret marrying him. That's kind of huge." I rolled my eyes so hard they nearly popped out of my skull. "You sound just like him." By noon, I'd had enough. If Buck wanted to play ghost, fine. I'd remind myself I didn't need him, which in reality meant dragging Lillian to a club to prove a point to absolutely no one. What happened next? Well, let's just say things got messy. Look, I didn't set out to cause chaos that night, but sometimes a girl needs to feel something, and Buck's disappearing act had me spinning through every emotion possible. Lillian was all in. "You need a distraction," she said, handing me a dress that was not exactly subtle. Short, tight, sparkly. Perfect for my screw you mood. The club was loud, packed, everything I needed. At first, I just let the music drown out my thoughts, let the bass replace my worries. But then, well, tequila makes me reckless. Some guy, tall, cocky, radiating confidence, sidled up next to me, smirking. "You look like trouble." "And you look like you don't care," I shot back, because let's be honest, sarcasm is my love language. One drink turned into two, then three. Before I knew it, I was laughing, his hand on my waist, my head tilted back like I didn't have a care in the world. Lillian had disappeared into the crowd, and I was making a statement. Was it petty? Absolutely. Wrong? Probably. But in that moment, it felt good. If Buck could just vanish, I had every right to remind myself what it felt like to be wanted. And then it happened. He kissed me. Right there, under the flashing neon lights, surrounded by a sea of strangers, like nothing else mattered. Did I stop him? Nope. I kissed him back. When we finally pulled apart, he grinned. "What's your name?" I smirked. The confidence not entirely real, but convincing enough. "Grace." He handed me his phone. I entered my number without hesitation, as if I hadn't already made enough impulsive choices for one evening. By the time Lillian and I stumbled out of the club, my mind was swirling, not just from the alcohol, but from the catastrophe I had just set in motion. Deep down, I could feel myself spiraling. Admitting it, though, not an option, not yet. Instead, I latched onto the flimsy excuse that Buck had it coming, that he deserved this for making me feel like I didn't matter. The guilt would come later, and when it did, it would hit like a freight train. But before we get to that, don't forget to hit subscribe. The next morning greeted me with a pounding headache, mascara smudged beneath my eyes, and my phone vibrating relentlessly. For a fleeting moment, I hoped it was Buck. Maybe he'd finally come to his senses, ready to make things right. No such luck. Instead, it was a message from the guy at the club. His name, apparently, was Joseph, as his text read, "Morning, Grace. Had a great time last night. Let's do it again soon." Groaning, I tossed my phone onto the nightstand like it had personally betrayed me. What the hell was I thinking? Lillian called around noon, undoubtedly eager to analyze my reckless decisions. "So, how's the queen of questionable life choices feeling today?" Her voice was far too chipper for my level of suffering. "Like absolute garbage," I muttered, dragging myself toward the kitchen in desperate need of coffee. "And before you say anything, yes, I know I screwed up." "Hey, no judgment," she replied breezily. "But maybe instead of collecting phone numbers from strangers, you should be figuring out where Buck is." I rolled my eyes, even though she couldn't see it. "Oh, so now you're on Team Buck." "I'm Team Grace," she corrected, her tone unexpectedly serious. "And right now, You're self-sabotaging, and we both know it. I wanted to argue, but she wasn't wrong. I already tried calling him, I admitted, massaging my temples. Twice, straight to voicemail. The rejection stung more than I cared to acknowledge. I hated the idea of being the desperate wife chasing after a man who clearly didn't want to be found. But as much as I wanted to ignore it, Lillian had a point. I needed to figure out where Buck had gone. So, I did what any modern woman in the throes of a breakdown would do. I turned into a detective. I scoured our bank statements for any trace of him. And there it was. A charge at a motel on the outskirts of town. Classy move, Buck. Real classy. Fueled by caffeine and righteous indignation, I grabbed my keys and drove straight there, fully prepared to drag him back home by that utterly forgettable haircut of his. But when I reached the front desk and asked for him, the receptionist hit me with a well-practiced customer service smile. Sorry, ma'am, we can't disclose guest information. My jaw tightened. Okay, but he's my husband, I said, leaning forward, and I need to talk to him. She didn't even flinch. I'm sorry, ma'am. Ma'am. I was seconds away from losing my composure, but even I knew throwing a tantrum wouldn't get me anywhere. Seething, I stormed out. He was here, I knew it, and yet he wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't even acknowledge my existence. By the time I got home, I was pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, anger bubbling beneath the surface. How dare he? I wasn't the villain here. Sure, maybe I had said some things I shouldn't have. But this was dramatic. And just as I was about to fire off a furious text, the front door creaked open. There he was. Buck. Calm, collected, acting as though he hadn't just disappeared for 2 days while I unraveled. Oh, so now you decide to show up, I snapped, arms crossed as I leaned against the counter. Had yourself a nice little vacation? He didn't answer right away. He set his bag down, shrugged off his jacket, then finally met my gaze. We need to talk. His voice was maddeningly steady. No kidding. My frustration boiled over. 2 days, Buck. 2. You couldn't pick up the damn phone? Not even a text? He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, his go-to move when trying to stay composed. I needed space, Grace. I needed time to figure out how to even have this conversation. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Oh, please. You overheard one private comment that wasn't even meant for you, and now you're acting like some kind of martyr. His expression darkened, but he didn't take the bait. It wasn't just one comment, he said quietly. It was something you don't say about someone you love, even in private. Oh, come on, Buck, I scoffed. People vent. You're the one who decided to eavesdrop. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Eavesdrop? He repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. Are you seriously blaming me for hearing you say you regret marrying me? I opened my mouth to respond, but ding. A text. Buck's eyes snapped to my phone, sitting on the counter. Mine followed. And there it was. A message from Joseph. His jaw tightened as he reached for my phone before I could stop him. He read the screen, his expression unreadable. Joseph? He echoed, holding up the device. Who the hell is Joseph, Grace? My stomach dropped. It's not what you think, I blurted. The worst possible thing to say in that moment. Oh, really? His voice was low, sharp. So some guy texting you about last night isn't what I think it is? I wanted to explain, to lie, to say something, anything, but no words came out. Buck let out a dry, humorless laugh and set the phone down. You've got to be kidding me. Buck, wait. I reached for him, desperate, but he shook his head. You were just what? His voice cracked. Blowing off steam? Getting back at me? It was just a kiss, I admitted, my voice shaking. It didn't mean anything. And that's supposed to make it better? His anger, barely restrained, finally broke free. You think this is how you fix things? By running off and kissing some random guy? I didn't sleep with him, I fired back, my voice splintering. Oh, well, that's a relief, he snapped sarcastically, Because that really changes everything. He grabbed his bag, slinging it over his shoulder, heading for the door. Wait! Tears blurred my vision. Buck, please, let's talk about this. I messed up, okay? I know I did, but we can fix this. He hesitated at the doorway, glancing back. For a moment, I thought he might stay. But then he shook his head. You don't get it, Grace. I'm done. I flinched, the words cutting deep. I've spent years trying to be enough for you, he continued, and all I get in return is criticism and betrayal. I deserve better than this. Buck, please! My voice broke, barely a whisper, but he didn't say another word. He stepped outside, shutting the door behind him, leaving me standing in the wreckage of what used to be our life. The house felt empty without him, a heavy silence stretching across the rooms, pressing in from all sides. It was the kind of stillness that made the absence unbearable, amplifying the void he had left behind. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the door as though sheer determination could will him back through it, make him change his mind. But he didn't. He wouldn't. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. My mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. How had we come to this? How had we unraveled from something stable, whether real or just an illusion, into something so utterly broken? I wanted to put it all on him. God, I wanted to. If only he had stayed, if only he had chosen to talk instead of turning away, maybe we wouldn't be here. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was all his fault, I knew the truth was more complicated. This wasn't just about a careless comment or even what had happened with Joseph. It ran deeper than that. Years of small wounds, quiet resentments, the way I had chipped away at him piece by piece just to make myself feel whole. I had taken him for granted, his patience, his loyalty, his quiet, steady love. And now, he was gone. The days blurred together, each one identical to the last. I moved through life on autopilot, detached from everything around me. Work felt meaningless. Food tasted like nothing. Sleep was elusive. And when I did drift off, his voice echoed in my dreams, calm, resolute, and final. I deserve better. The words cut deep, a wound that refused to heal. I tried reaching out. At first, a casual message. Hey, just checking in. Are you okay? No reply. Then another, more desperate. Can we please talk? I'm sorry, I mean it. Still, nothing. By the end of the week, I was unraveling. I needed to see him, to explain, to fix this somehow. So when Saturday came, and he said he'd be by to pick up his things, I told myself this was my chance. Maybe, just maybe, I could make him stay. But when he walked through the door, he wasn't the same. His posture was straighter, his jaw set with quiet determination. He had trimmed his beard, was wearing a shirt that actually fit him well, and even smelled different, like he had started wearing cologne again. He looked good. Too good. As if he had already moved on while I was still sifting through the wreckage. Hey, I said tentatively, standing by the kitchen counter. Hey, he answered, his voice polite but distant. He headed straight to the bedroom, moving with efficiency, packing his things like this was just another chore to check off his list. I hesitated before following him, my stomach tight with nerves. Buck, can we talk? My voice came out softer than I intended. He didn't even glance at me. About what? About us, I pleaded, stepping closer. I know I messed up, okay? But I don't want to lose you. He finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. Grace, your feelings were clear. I'm just here to get my stuff. That's not fair, I protested, desperation creeping into my voice. You don't understand. He cut me off, his tone sharp but controlled. I don't understand. You kissed another guy, Grace. You gave him your number. What exactly am I missing? Tears burned my eyes, but I blinked them back. It was a mistake. I was upset, and I wasn't thinking. No, he said firmly, his gaze unwavering. You were thinking. You just didn't think I'd find out. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because he wasn't. "Do you even want this marriage?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "Or am I just filling a space in a life you wish were different?" His words hit like a punch to the gut. My throat tightened, and this time, I couldn't stop the tears. "I want you, Buck," I whispered. "I know I've been awful. I know I took you for granted. But I can change. I will change." He exhaled slowly, setting down the box in his hands. "I hope you do. Not for me. For yourself. But I can't keep doing this. I spent years trying to be enough for you, and all it did was make me feel like less." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Shaking his head, he said softly, "I deserve better, and so do you. Maybe we're just not what each other needs anymore." And just like that, it was over. He finished packing, gave me one last look, a mixture of sadness and finality, then walked out, leaving me alone in the mess I had made. For days, I clung to the hope that he would come back, that this was just another fight and we'd find our way back to each other like always. But this time was different. When he finally did text, it was short, distant. "Hope you're doing okay. I'll stop by this weekend for the rest of my things." No warmth, no invitation to talk. Just another reminder of how much had changed. By the time Saturday arrived, I was frantic, rehearsing what I would say, convincing myself that if I just found the right words, I could fix this. I even cleaned the house, as if a spotless living room could erase the damage. But when he walked in, he seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted. He looked good, unfairly good. "Hey!" he greeted, neutral as he placed a few boxes by the door. "Hey!" I murmured, barely audible. I watched as he moved through the house, methodical and precise, each packed item another nail in the coffin. This was real. He wasn't bluffing. "Buck," I broke the silence, "can we please talk?" He sighed, pausing just long enough to meet my gaze. "Grace, we have talked. There's nothing left to say." "There's everything left to say," I choked out. "I love you, Buck. I know I messed up, but I'll do whatever it takes." He ran a hand through his hair, his expression weary. "I believe you. But the problem is, it's always me trying to keep us together. You only want to change now because you're afraid of losing me. But where was that when I needed you to see me?" "I see you now," I whispered, my vision blurred with tears. "It's too late," he said softly. "I gave you everything, Grace. And now? I have nothing left to give." I reached out one last time, desperate. "Please, Buck. Therapy, counseling, anything. We can fix this." He gently pulled away. "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because, for once, I need to choose myself. And maybe you need to do the same." And then he was gone. A month later, I saw him at a coffee shop. He was laughing with a woman I didn't recognize. She wasn't stunning, but she had an easy confidence about her, something real, something I could never fake. And he looked happy, really happy. When he noticed me, his smile faltered for just a second. He gave a small nod, acknowledgement, not invitation, before turning back to her. And as I walked away, the weight of everything I had done, everything I had lost, crashed down around me. This was my fault. And the worst part, I had no one to blame but myself.
My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.